Okay.
Good morning, folks. Today, an interesting topical subject, which I'm sure is of interest to us all. This is presented to us by Graham Davey, and it was a slightly amusing statement because what I've got is who started the Ukraine war? Graham Davey, which I think might be, I will translate that to a better sense of Graham is going to give us the views on the start of the Ukrainian war. Graham.
Thank you very much, Ray. No, I didn't start it, but I have spent quite a lot of time studying the background and trying to work out the answer to the question, who started it. I outline of what I'm going to say. First of all, a very superficial and totally inadequate look at the three main players in the tragedy of what is happening in Ukraine, the United States, Russia, and Ukraine itself. And then secondly, history of key events in Europe, followed by the history of more recent events in Ukraine itself. My comments on the question posed by the title of this talk. So that's going to be purely my opinion. And finally, leaving you with two questions, neither of which you will be able to answer. I should be very surprised if you do anyway. But first of all, looking at the three major players in the disaster of what is going on at the moment. United States. I think the key thing with both the United States and Russia is the people's attitude to their country, national pride. And national pride in the United States, it seems to be, is based firstly on economic strength. And this may arise from a population which is almost entirely immigrant, and immigrants tend to be more adventurous, more enterprising than the average member of the population. So the whole of the American population has got this get up and go attitude. If you fail, you drop out and you try something else. If you succeed, you make money. And that has led to enormous economic strength. Secondly, military strength. You don't see the great military parades in the United States that they have in Russia. But the fact that the United States has got over 700 military bases around the world, mainly clustered around Russia and China, is an example of the dominating influence of the American military, fulfilling what they see as their role in life, which is to be the world's policeman. That, in fact, of course, is closely linked to economic pressure to the advantage of the major multinational firms. I think probably in the United States, more than many other countries, there is support for the capitalist economic system. There is, of course, great variation within the population of the United States. There's no policy or idea, however crazy, which is not represented by some group within the United States, but they surely come pretty close to uniting in believing that capitalism is the right way forward for them and therefore for everybody else. By that they mean the free interplay of market forces, equal opportunities for all, a minimal role for the state, and an anti-communist feeling, which of course came to its peak at the time of the McCarthy era in the 1950s. They also believe in what they call democracy. Democracy in the United States, as in Britain, has become corrupted by the power of money and lobbying, but still the principle is there that the people have a right to have a say in how their country is governed. The Americans go rather further than that and think that everybody else should have their version of democracy, perhaps cleaned up a bit. And so there have been over 50 attempts at regime change in other countries. So their complaints about Russia invading Ukraine are rather hypocritical in the view of what the United States has done in the past, and no doubt will continue to do. Moving on to Russia, again, there's national pride, and it's also linked to military strength. You get there in Moscow annual huge parades of military personnel and equipment, but I would guess that their attitude to military strength and pride in the military is based more on their resilience to invasion, aided very much, of course, in the past by the Russian winter, and the fact that they have survived these invasions. What the values and feelings of the Russian people are is very difficult to determine, because they are not free, of course, to think in a way that they might, had they been open to a free movement of ideas. So they are, as we all would be in that situation, subject to endless propaganda and state-controlled media. I would guess that in Russia there is greater national pride in their cultural heritage than there is in the United States, particularly, of course, in literature and music. Even Putin must be conscious of this, that this is a country which has a lot to be proud of in what it has contributed to world culture in the past. I would guess also that whether it is the product of propaganda or something inherited, that there is a greater sympathy for communism, obviously, than there is in the United States. And by that, they are thinking of a more equal society, an important role for the state in providing universal benefits. And there's no tradition in Russia of any form of democracy, really. They have moved from a long period of Tsarist rule to, following the Russian Revolution, a series of despots who have been pretty ruthless in their elimination of opposition and holding meaningful free elections. So the idea of a genuine democracy is something which is more or less absent, I think, from their thinking. They may hold it as an ideal, but an unattainable one. One thing which the United States and Russia, as would-be superpowers, have in common is a general disdain for the United Nations, almost bordering on contempt at times. It just doesn't come into their thinking to anything like the extent that some of us think it should. Moving on to Ukraine, going back a few years, no, more than a few years, I think, it always used to be called the Ukraine, not Ukraine, and we thought of it simply as a part of Russia or the Soviet Union. And it has in fact been a part of Russia since 1765. It's a very large country, roughly the size of Germany and France put together. And it's rich in resources, particularly, as we've learned recently, agriculture and grain production. After the revolution of 1917, it became part of the Soviet Union. During the Second World War, it was occupied by the Nazis for 4 years, and some 5 million people from Ukraine died. And then after the Second World War, member of the Soviet USSR, until that disintegrated in 1989, 1990. And then in 1991, it made a declaration of independence. During the 1950s, there were transfers of land from Poland and Hungary, and the Crimea was transferred from Russia, although Russia retained a naval base at Sevastopol. And none of this was of any great significance, because all at that time in the 1950s were part of the Soviet Empire. But of course, from 1991, that was the first step towards Ukraine becoming a nation with a defined boundary. Later on, it had its own currency and official language and so on. It has a very disparate population of about 41 million, arising from its very short history as a nation. There are, first of all, in the east, as you know, Russian-speaking Ukrainians whose sympathies are very much with Russia. And then further to the west, they're much more oriented towards Poland, Hungary, and Ukrainian speaking. There is an extreme right-wing faction, possibly derived from collusion with the Nazis during the Second World War. And that has given rise to Putin's accusations of there being Nazis in Ukraine whose presence justifies the invasion. In the referendum, which took place in 1991 on independence, there was a substantial majority, it's said to be 91%, for independence. So the Russian sympathizers in the East form a pretty small minority of the total population. Since 1991, Ukraine has been the subject, I would say the victim, of a tug of war between Russia and the West, with changes in the president and various dirty tricks going on by either side to try and draw Ukraine into either Russian influence or embedded in the West by means of membership of NATO and the European Union. Moving on to key events in Europe in the past, I remember my father, well before the end of the Second World War, saying the two forces fighting Germany, Russia in the east, and United States and allies in the west are much more interested in grabbing land than they are in defeating Germany. Now, obviously, defeating Germany in the war was an essential precondition, but there was a conscious attempt by both groups of allies to get as much land as possible, because that would be the basis of future influence and in the case of Russia, control. A significant event and related to what is going on in Ukraine now is the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1963, when Kennedy and Khrushchev came pretty close to starting a Third World War, which would have been a nuclear war. And the reason, as you know, was that Russians were starting to build missile sites on Cuba. The sensitivity of the United States to that, as they saw it, proximity of a Russian threat, is as nothing really compared with the fear that Putin and other Russian leaders must have at the prospect of Ukraine joining NATO and allowing American missiles to be placed so as close as they like to the Russian border. So that contrast, I think, is significant. 1989 and 90, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and Germany eventually unified. In the United States, that was seen as a triumph for capitalism and democracy. And in Russia, as Putin has said, or has implied, he hasn't actually said it, humiliation and fear of what was to come. United States encouraged NATO expansion. All these former republics of the Soviet Empire became independent countries, and United States was keen to provide them with the security of what they claimed was a purely defensive alliance, NATO. And right from the beginning, 1992, Russia objected to this. The George Bush administration in 1991 was split. It wasn't united in calling for these republics to join NATO. Dick Cheney was the defense secretary, and he was very keen on NATO expansion, as you might expect. Thought the United States should do everything to accelerate the collapse of the Soviet Union and the accession of the freed republics to join NATO. James Baker was Secretary of State, American Foreign Minister, and he argued that it was essential to keep the Soviet Union in one piece in order to stop the uncontrolled spread of some 35,000 nuclear warheads. So it wasn't a moral principle, a recognition of Russia's attitude after the collapse of the Soviet Empire, but more a practical thing about the safety of the world if these nuclear weapons got into the wrong hands. 1992, Bill Clinton replaced Bush as president, and he wanted to avoid a new Iron Curtain simply being moved to the east. So he was certainly not keen on NATO expansion. Whether he actually opposed it, it's difficult to say. But his argument was that he wanted to avoid leaving the former Soviet republics to their own devices. You can interpret that as wanting control over them, but he was certainly not as gung-ho about NATO expansion as Dick Cheney was. And at this time, 1992, 1993, there was a move to form what was called the Partnership for Peace. Now, this was, I think, based on a number of arguments, but one of them was the recognition that Russia needed a sense of security and saw NATO as a threat to their well-being and normal, traditional way of governance. It was a scheme for a new security structure and was accepted by the United States, by Russia, by Ukraine, and somewhat reluctantly by the former Soviet East European republics. And then in 1994, that project, which might have been so helpful in avoiding the current war, collapsed when Yeltsin invaded Chechnya, which was showing signs of wanting liberalization and links with the West, and the Russian army moved in. The East European former Soviet countries feared Russian aggression, and so they were keen on joining NATO in order to provide their own security. And then domestic politics in the United States clicked in. If there was doubt about the right of these newly independent countries to join NATO, then the Republicans gained strength. They wanted NATO to expand indefinitely. No doubt some of them wanted the complete collapse of Russia itself. And because they were gaining strength in key seats of the congressional elections, they threatened Clinton's aim of a second term as president in 1996. So Clinton saw the need, in order to get this second term as president, to appease the wishes of Republicans, particularly in the marginal seats. And he switched from endorsing an incremental accession to NATO to unrestricted enlargement. And this happened in two main tranches, one in 1999, when Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary were accepted into membership, and then in 2004, Well, the Baltic countries, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Romania, Bulgaria, all came into membership. And what started as an alliance of 12 countries in 1945 or 6 is now 32. And if I were showing you the map, you would see how the Iron Curtain has moved, what, 300 miles to the east, and is now including in the West every country outside the borders of Russia, apart from Belarus and Ukraine. So you could see from Putin's point of view, if Ukraine, which was coming more and more under the influence of the United States and the European Union, if that went, then he would be, and the Russian people, extremely isolated. They saw isolation as being a threat to their continued existence. It's important, I think, to say that in all the opposition which Russia, mainly through Putin, expressed to NATO enlargement, there was never any question of denying national sovereignty or national identity to Ukraine. I changed from using the word sovereignty because Putin didn't want them to be a sovereign power completely free to align either to the West or to Russia. Obviously, he wanted to maintain influence and prevent Ukraine joining NATO in particular, but also the European Union. But there was he had no serious intention of occupying the country and taking control of it. That point was emphasized by an academic at the University of Chicago, John Mearsheimer, who has done a lot of talks available on YouTube about this. And, that one rings true to me. There was opposition to NATO expansion in the West, and in May 1998 in the United Kingdom, there was a move to influence Tony Blair, who had taken over in 1997 as Prime Minister. And there was a message, a letter sent to him from Dennis Healey, former Foreign Secretary, from several former United Kingdom ambassadors to other countries, retired defense officials, civil servants, and retired military leaders, all uniting in calling on the Prime Minister, Tony Blair, to do what he could to stop NATO expansion. These were all former government ministers or retired civil servants and military, because those actually in office or employed by the government couldn't lobby in this way. But it must have been quite a formidable gathering of experience and possibly wisdom, who saw the dangers of NATO expanding so much. Robin Cook, who was the Foreign Secretary, in fact supported NATO expansion in the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland. That was the issue at that time, and probably would have continued to support the accession of other former East European countries, because he said, they should be free to share the security and prosperity of the West. That was the counter argument. If there was any opposition in the United States to NATO expansion, I think it would have been eliminated in 2008 when Russia invaded Georgia and indicated very clearly that they were not going to put up with any liberalization of countries which they regarded as being within their sphere of influence. Again, there were moves in Georgia to liberalize the country and link up with the West, and the Russians invaded and continue to occupy and rule 2 regions of Georgia, amounting to about 20% of the country, and that situation will continue indefinitely. What's been happening in Ukraine since 1991? There is a growing movement in Ukraine for full sovereignty, i.e. freedom to join European Union and NATO. That nationalistic feeling was enhanced by the Chernobyl explosion in 1986, when people became much more aware of environmental issues, and these were in Ukraine linked to nationalistic aims. 1989 and 90, the East European countries threw off Soviet rule. The declaration in Ukraine of independence and international recognition of Ukraine for the first time as a nation state. 1996, new democratic constitution, new currency, and the president, Yanukovych, was pro-Russia. So Russians were content with that. And then in 2002, the general election produced a hung parliament. The opposition alleged fraud, which was probably the case. And the government launched a formal bid to join NATO. 2004, the Orange Revolution started. There were mass protests, and the Supreme Court annulled the past election. In the rerun election, the opposition leader, Yushchenko, was elected as president, and he was in favor of Ukraine linking up with the West. So you can see the unfortunate newly created nation was immediately subject of a tug of war between Moscow and Washington, and this is represented by changes in the presidency and elections which are of questionable validity anyway. 2006, one of several political parties in the country, the Socialist Party, left the coalition of groups which represented the Orange Revolution and formed a new coalition with the communists and with Yanukovych's Party of the Regions. Now that put Russian-oriented political parties in Ukraine in a majority, and it's possible, if not likely, that Russia had some influence in causing the Socialist Party to switch and change that majority in the Ukrainian parliament. In 2010, Yanukovych won the presidential election, and Parliament voted to abandon the NATO membership bid. But trouble broke out again in 2013 with what became known as the Maidan Revolution, Maidan being a large square for public gatherings in Lviv, the capital. In November 2013, Yanukovych rejected a planned deal with the European Union. Now, Yanukovych was the Russian sympathizer, and it's likely that, again, Russia was influencing him to break this potential tie to the European Union. Protesters in the Maidan Square seized the city hall, and Putin stepped in to try and bribe the protesters by offering a $15 billion loan to Ukraine. This was unsuccessful, and the protests at the end of 2013 and beginning of 2014 became more serious. A total of about 70 people were killed, and the protesters were infiltrated by fascist elements who were armed. So it was getting really quite serious. 2014, fighting broke out in East Ukraine. I've said there were Russian sympathizers there anyway, and conflict was always a possibility. It may be that Russian forces stirred up that conflict and started the fighting, or helped it. No one really knows. In May 2014, there were elections again for the presidency, and a pro-Western businessman, Poroshenko, was elected as president. And then in 2019, there was an election again, and in the runoff to that, the present President Zelensky won against Poroshenko, and has shown obviously great charismatic leadership in uniting the country against the Russian invasion, which took place last year. Was the United States quietly watching all this happen? No, they were getting involved, as you might expect. We know much more about this than we do about Russian involvement, but that was there as well, I'm sure. There was too much at stake. And the Americans showed from certainly 2008, that they wanted Ukraine to join NATO. There was support for the Maidan demonstrators from Senator John McCain, who went to Kyiv for about 2 months between December 13th and January 2014, and he dined with opposition leaders, including the ultra-right-wing Svoboda Party, and appeared on stage in the Maidan with its leader. So there's an American senator closely associating himself with the right-wing extremists in Ukraine. And then, perhaps more seriously, Victoria Nuland, who was Assistant Secretary of State, went to Ukraine 3 times during the Maidan demonstrations and was filmed giving out cookies. She and the United States ambassador discussed who would be the best personnel for a replacement government in Ukraine. You talk about influencing leadership of other countries. Here were 2 Americans in Ukraine discussing who should be the next leader of the country. And they decided on a chap called Yatsenyuk, who became prime minister when Viktor Yanukovych was ousted and fled the country because of the severity of those demonstrations. On the 29th of February 2014, as the demonstrations came to an end, the Washington Post celebrated the fact that Yanukovych had been kicked out, overthrown, and fled for his life to Moscow. And the Washington Post said, "The moves were democratic. Kyiv is now controlled by pro-Western parties." So there's an expression of triumphalism from the Washington Post, and no doubt many other Americans, that had all been above board, and Ukraine was now safely within the United States orbit and area of influence. My comments now on the question posed by the title, "Who started the war in Ukraine?" First of all, the war is a complete disaster. If you compare the number of deaths and the destruction of infrastructure and buildings, the earthquakes in Turkey and Syria are relatively minor. They are virtually nothing compared with what has already happened in Ukraine and will continue to happen over the next, who knows, 1, 2, 3 years. Who started it? Well, obviously, the initial move was Putin. So the accumulation of Russian forces on the border and their movement into the country was the start of a war in February 2022. But the more important question is who caused it? And I would say in relation to this that while both sides are guilty, there's a greater measure of guilt on the United States than there is on Russia. The United States failed to accept that Putin saw NATO expansion as a threat to their existence. They never took that seriously. They went on claiming that NATO was a purely defensive alliance. We were unable to see the situation from Putin's point of view. they failed to see that by his words and actions, Putin was in fact setting out an ultimatum to the United States and the West, saying, in effect, you either create a security structure in Europe which ensures the safety and security of Russia itself, and that would have been a buffer region of neutral states, or Russia will destroy Ukraine. We will trash it. We've shown what we can do with it. Cities like Aleppo reduced to rubble. That will happen in Ukraine, and it has already happened, of course, in Mariupol, and it's happening now in Bakhmut. And the United States really failed to understand that and to respond to it. The United States president is not a free individual. He is subject to enormous pressures from lobby groups, from military, and from industry. And one of the consequences of that is that Russia has to be seen constantly as a threat. Otherwise, the military-industrial partnership in the United States would be seriously weakened. Thank you. They also didn't recognize that the danger of the Russian aggression was not an attempt to occupy Ukraine or start creating a new Russian empire. Putin would have been well aware of all the problems of holding on to control of countries in the Soviet Union. There had to be military interventions in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Chechnya, Georgia, and they had all had stable rule from Moscow. So they would have had no great reason to resist and that rule and join the West. In 2022, the East European republics from the Soviet Union had had 30 years of relative freedom, a higher standard of living, and some form of democracy, usually pretty good with what had gone on under Soviet rule. And the idea that Russian troops could go in and not be resisted was inconceivable. And yet, of course, from the United States point of view, Russia had to be seen as potential aggressors anywhere. And so you've got even Finland and Sweden, who I would say have no danger of invasion from Soviet Union, joining NATO now to get that what they see as extra protection. Now, my final two questions. With his ability as a leader, national leader, which has emerged over the last 18 months, could Zelensky have stopped armed resistance to the Russian forces. There's a comparison here with what happened in the Czech Republic under Alexander Dubček in 1968, when movements towards alignment with the West were, and the Velvet Revolution threatened to take Czech Republic out of the Soviet Union, and the Russian tanks rolled in to make sure that that did not happen. But also, it wasn't just the tanks, it was just an army of 500,000 Russians went in as well to occupy and control the country. So it would have been unrealistic for Dubček to have attempted military resistance to that. And the penalty was another over 20 years of Soviet rule. But the advantage is that there was no war. There was no continued fighting. There were no hundreds of thousands of deaths and flattened buildings. What if Zelensky had taken the same course of action? Would the people have supported him and carried out that practice of non-violent civil resistance rather than taking on the Russian army as a military combat? So that's my first question. Second question, what could be done now to end the war? I said they were difficult questions, but I shall listen to your attempted replies with great interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Graham. Thank you. I'm sitting here stunned, actually. That was such a brilliant exposition of the position today. It was so very, very helpful. Thank you very much indeed. Yes, really very impressive, in fact. Thank you. I don't know, would this should be, Ray, I have spoken across today.
Oh, sorry, Patsy, didn't hear.
It's all right. I think I spoke across you. It was a mistake. I'm sorry.
No, you carry over. Perfectly done. My question, I suppose, is going back slight away to the statement that the Ukrainian government, as it is now, has fascist leanings. Is this an American slur, or can we read anything into it?
It's said that all countries have fascist groups within them. Certainly, there is. Switching back to my headset microphone, is that clearer now?
Yes, very, very great. Yeah.
The groups depend on the size, but there are always right-wing extremists. It's a more significant group, I think, within Ukraine than it is in this country. We've seen even in Germany some fascist elements are still there, still active, and still trying to influence the country. Just how big it is, I don't know. But this party that the American senator was associated with in 2013, 2014 is a party represented in the parliament, Svoboda, and is described as extreme right wing, which suggests that there is rather more of this fascist influence in Ukraine than there is in most other countries, which is a pity. It certainly doesn't justify Putin's claim that he's invading Ukraine in order to fight the Nazis, but they are there. I don't know whether David Saunders, when he gets back, will be able to incorporate it, but I'll seek out the map of NATO expansion in Europe, which I was going to show you. There is a rather better one, which I found on the BBC website, showing the individual countries more clearly, with the number of American military personnel in each country, each NATO country, who are not attached to NATO. In other words, they came under the direct control of the Pentagon. And with all the new NATO members, it was only Estonia which did not have this extra number of Pentagon-controlled American military personnel. So what are they there for? Almost certainly spying. And if Ukraine joined NATO, not only would the United States, as leading member of NATO, be free to place its missiles along the Russian border anywhere they liked, but they would also possibly have these extra personnel not under the control of NATO, but under the direct control of the Pentagon, to do whatever the Pentagon wanted them to do. So looking at that situation from Putin's point of view, it is totally unacceptable, as it would be for the President of the United States or any other country to have a hostile presence along your borders.
Graham, your talk was so informative. I feel I want to hear it again and again before I can even formulate the questions. I presume you feel fairly pessimistic about it all.
Well, the lack of answers from you about what can be done to stop it is widely shared, I think. I haven't got a clue at this stage. Once a war has started, it's very difficult to stop it until there is total victory and defeat on the other side. I felt right from the beginning, through both being a Quaker and supporter of the Stop the War campaign, that all the effort should have been not to help Ukraine to win, but to stop the fighting. And as long as the fighting continues, Russia will, I think, continue to follow this threatening line of destruction of city after city. They don't have unlimited military resources to put in, and it may be that Putin will cut his losses and come to some negotiating agreement, whether Zelensky and Ukraine will accept any sort of compromise. I don't know, compromise on both sides is going to be needed if the fighting is to stop. That should be our main aim. But so much has just been expended in human suffering so far that the mood in Ukraine will be, we've got to continue. We've got to see this through to the end. And
Would
that
you-
means it will go on.
Would you comment on the UK's government's action or inaction? Please.
Ukraine government's action or
No,
inaction.
the UK's action or inaction, or attitude or opinion, or
Yeah, they are becoming more and more dependent on military aid from the United States and the rest of the NATO countries. And there's to no significant move.
Graham, I think you misheard Mary's question. She asked what the UK government, not the
Oh,
UK.
sorry. I'm sorry. I'd like to know more about this message, lobbying call from the retired politicians and military people in 1998 to Prime Minister Blair. While we have a Conservative government, Conservative Party and negotiation and compromise don't seem to go well together. And whatever we said as a United Kingdom government would have minimal influence on what the United States was doing. United States is a dominant influence in the West. And because of its economic power as well as its military power, no NATO country is just going to seriously challenge what US president is going to do.
I fear Graham, as Blair joined in the attack on Iraq, showed that he was in the pocket of American interest, and there was no way he was going to actually have other ministers trying to dictate to him, sadly.
Yeah.
You were going to say something, Hattie?
I can't remember what it was about that, but I have got a question. I need clarification really about this, what the sovereign bit meant. I know that you did try to explain it just then, but sovereign means that they're fully in charge of their country and nobody else interferes. But what's the next one down where Russia's, they are part of Russia, but not called sovereign, semi-independent or something? What's the kind of explanation and phrases used?
I think I may have said national integrity. That Russia recognizes Ukraine's right to exist as a country governing itself. But the limitation is Russia would not allow that independent country to be a sovereign state, fully independent and able to align itself as it please, because it would please Ukraine's government and many of its people to be members of NATO and members of the European Union, and therefore tied up totally with the West. I don't think Russia is in any way seeking domination of Ukraine, and that's why I would believe, I believe it would be acceptable to Russia if there were some guarantee of Ukraine's neutrality, perhaps controlled by that neutrality, controlled by a United Nations force, which would not involve any American or indeed NATO countries taking part, which leaves the African countries who have not been wholehearted in their support of NATO expansion and supporting Ukraine, who might be acceptable to Russia as a force to be stationed in Ukraine and to make sure that its borders remain secure. So that would give them security. The compromise on Ukraine's part would be, okay, we accept our future is going to be as a neutral country, or preferably part of a bloc of neutral countries who will provide a buffer between the West and Russia. And the problem is, of course, that the other relevant countries in East Europe are no longer neutral. They're in NATO. So it's hardly conceivable that any of them would be willing to give up NATO membership and adopt neutrality in order to give Russia the security it wants and needs.
Of course, there is another country which seems to hover above this and is extraordinarily powerful, and that is China, with Xi Jinping, who met Putin quite a small while ago, and they have the power and resources to do a lot more damage than any European country can. Jonathan.
Graham, your talk's mainly been about NATO expansion. Is the wish of Ukraine to join the EU part of a threat to Russia, or do Russians not care so much about that? Is it mainly, you've emphasized NATO all along rather than the EU, rather than the EU?
This is, for all of us, pure speculation. My guess would be that Putin would regard membership of the European Union as the first step towards a greater alignment between the country and NATO and the West generally. It's about areas of influence, and if Ukraine were in the European Union, Russia would be less able to have any influence on government policy in Ukraine. During the Turf War period, it was initial moves towards membership of the European Union, which stimulated Russia into intervention and trying to influence and succeeding in influencing elections in Ukraine to create a president who would discontinue that approach to the European Union and align the country more fully with Moscow. But having said that, I'm sure the military aspect of NATO membership was and is much more important to Putin than joining the European Union. All these issues are linked, aren't they? Joining the European Union would probably brought better trade and prosperity to Ukraine, and that would be the first step towards seeking and probably getting their complete sovereign independence, which would allow them to do other things and break away completely from Russian influence. So unacceptable to Putin.
Mm.
So who would give them sovereign independence? Would that be the countries saying themselves, right, we want sovereign independence now? Or would they kind of have to ask permission of Russia?
I think it's more on a case-by-case basis that the government would simply initiate the movement towards NATO membership, for example, and defy Russia to challenge it. And if the whole, it would be probably parallel to the breakup of the Soviet Union. That these were people living controlled and oppressive form of government, who could see on their television screens that life was so different on the other side of the Iron Curtain. And the same thing might happen in Ukraine sometime in the future. But at the moment, the main problem is getting out of this desperate, tragic situation. It's gone 12:15. We ought to stop, I think.
Just what I was thinking. Well, thank you, Graham. That was, as I said before, an enlightening and interesting lecture, which I'm sure we all have
Absolutely.
learned more and are interested to follow this more closely. So
Thank
thank you
you.
very much.
Thank you very much. I just feel that if it has succeeded, it has drawn attention to the roots of the war, which go back a long time, 30 years. It didn't start in February 2022. It started long before. And there were people, the academic I mentioned, John Mearsheimer, who in 2016 said, there will be war, Russia will invade. It was predicted, and it was, sure to him, not unexpected, but the invasion took place, but no one paid enough attention to what he and others were saying all those years ago. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Graham.
Thank
Thank you.
Graham.
Thank
Got
you.
it, folks.
Next week.
Next week, we have Jonathan, who I will read the title. Dr. William Price, is Price right? Of Llanthrusen and the introduction of cremation into Britain.
Not such a weighty topic as we've had today, but it's a bit of a fun story. And I guess Hattie's signed endless cremation forms and has had no idea what the legality behind it all was.
It sounds jolly interesting to me anyway. Thank you.
Good. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Yes,
and see you again, friends.